The topic, visions of the afterlife in the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls, is a very large topic. And I'm going to give you some steps in the development of that process. The punchline is that in the beginning, in the Hebrew Bible, there really isn't an afterlife. And so what I'm going to show you is how the idea of the afterlife came into being. Okay, so this is the origins of the idea of the afterlife in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So this is very big, significant stuff. There's a lot of different directions, a lot of different movements in the crystallization of this idea of the afterlife. And I will really just be showing you some pictures, some greatest hits in the development of this idea. Can you all hear me, by the way? Okay, good. So this first slide, and I'm pleased that I have a remote control here for the slide. And I think if I push the wrong buttons, I get The Simpsons. So forgive me if that happens. This is a picture behind the words is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is called the Temple Scroll. And so these are very ancient texts, and we're going to see that the Dead Sea Scrolls play a particularly pivotal role in the development and crystallization of the idea of the afterlife. But first, let's start at the beginning. Here we go. In the beginning, which is, as Mary Poppins once said, a very good place to start. Is that right? Was that the right movie? Oh, no, The Sound of Music. Okay, sorry. So you all remember that. When I tell my students these things, I just get blank stares. In the beginning, there's actually two different creation stories in the beginning part of the book of Genesis. But this is the key one, the creation of Adam in the beginning of Genesis 2. And here is a nice picture. I don't think this was live, this photograph. But you can see there, God has just created Adam, and he's breathing into his nose the breath of life. Okay? So this shows us in the imagery of the creation of the first human, the concept of life, and it also implies a concept of death. And that is that humans are made of two different substances. Adam is created from the earth. There's actually a word play here between the word human, which is Adam, and the word for earth, which is Adamah. So within Hebrew, it's a word play. Adam is created from the Adamah. And this has a lot of resonances. Humans are created from the earth. So it says that God formed the first man the first human from the earth, and then breathed into his nose the breath of life. Now this is a concept of what humans are made of, okay? And it's fairly accurate, okay? We are made of earth, chemicals and things. What happens when we die? This will be on the quiz afterwards. What happens to your body when you die? You return to the earth. So from dust to dust. From the earth you come, to the earth you go. You biodegrade. This is very ecologically sound. What is this breath of life then? Well, I can tell you that everybody here, I assume, is breathing. Okay? Because you need to breathe to be alive. So in the ancient biblical conception, people are earth creatures, but they are enlivened by this breath, which is God's breath. God breathes it in. It's sort of like a CPR thing. And you're alive as long as you're breathing. What happens when you stop breathing? You die, and your body turns back into the earth. Okay, so this is the biblical conception, that life comes from God's breath. When you die, the breath goes back to God, and your body dissolves into earth, the earth from which you were taken. Now notice here, in this concept in the Garden of Eden story, there is no afterlife. Okay, so this is the opening move in this development that I want to show you today. In the earliest situation, there is no afterlife. You're made of two different things, dirt and God's breath, and when you die, they separate and go back to where they came from. No afterlife. So we want to find where this idea of the afterlife comes from. Now, the idea of death is one of the concerns of the Garden of Eden story. As some of you will remember, there's two special trees in the middle of the garden. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of there's the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then there's also the tree of life. Now, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, so be careful here. The people eat from one of the tree and are expelled from the garden so that they don't eat from the other tree. They eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore they become knowledgeable. They become, in fact, in the story, they become like gods, knowing good and evil. And then God expels them from the garden so that they don't also eat from the tree of life and live forever. Okay, so there is no living forever because people were expelled from the garden before they could eat of the fruit of the tree of life. Now, this will come back later in my story, after the idea of the afterlife comes into being, that this idea that one can, in some respects, go back to the Garden of Eden and eat the tree of life and live forever. But this is a later idea. Okay? Originally in the Garden of Eden, people are cast out of the garden so that they don't live forever. So in this picture, you see the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and the snake is there, enticing the humans to eat it. And then there's a skull at the bottom, that once they eat it, it says, death enters the picture. The story is a little ambiguous. It says, God says, when you eat from this fruit of this tree, on that day you will surely die. But it turns out that they don't die. In other words, God becomes a little more chill, is compassionate and doesn't kill them, but he does expel them from the garden so that they don't eat of the fruit of the tree of life and live forever. So when they're expelled, God says, you will eat from the earth, you will eat your bread by the sweat of your brow until you return to the earth, for from dust you come and to dust you shall return. What I think is going on there is the consciousness of death, that people gain knowledge, and part of that knowledge is knowledge of mortality. Knowledge that they will have to die. So death comes into the picture, both in terms of having to return to the dust, but also in knowing that you have to return to the dust. So this is the concept of life and death, of what happens after you die, in the Garden of Eden story. You biodegrade, you go to that great compost bin, and become earth again. And you return the breath of life to the source where it came from. Now, this is a widespread picture of what happens to you in the ancient world. Okay, that there really isn't any afterlife. You just die. But there is at the same time another stream of thinking where there is a kind of shadowy place where your breath or your spirit can go to, but it's a very hazy and vaguely unpleasant place. This is a picture of the Mesopotamian god Maragall, who is king of the underworld. The underworld, and this is in the Mesopotamian tradition and in the biblical tradition, there is an underworld where your spirit, in some sense, has a post-mortem existence, but it's a very shadowy existence. You're sort of a shade. In the Mesopotamian texts, the underworld is described as a kind of dusty place. It's dark, and in some instances, the people wear feathers like birds. Okay, so it's dark, dusty. It's sort of like a really bad, cheap hotel. The lighting is bad, and they eat dirt, and it's a fairly unpleasant place. So this is another concept of what happens, that your spirit does go somewhere, but it's not really alive in the afterworld. Okay, there's a kind of dwelling place. Sometimes people can feed you. They can make offerings to the ancestors who are living in this place. And in the Bible, this place is called Sheol. Sheol. Okay? So there is a shadowy half underworld existence, but it's not something, it's neither a place of reward nor a place of punishment. It's sort of where all the spirits go and just sort of spend their time doing nothing. Okay, so with these initial concepts of a kind of either lack of an afterlife or a kind of shady, shadowy afterlife, we move on to the next development of the steps towards an afterlife. The first step comes with one of the characters in Genesis named Enoch. Enoch has a very small role in the genealogies of the ancestors from Adam to Noah in Genesis 5. This is a picture of Enoch, an etching of Enoch by William Blake. And here's the text. It's in one of these begets. So-and-so begets so-and-so begets so-and-so in Genesis 5. And all of a sudden you get to Enoch. And it says, when Enoch, so Jared begot Enoch, and then Enoch lived 65 years. He became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God for 300 years. Now this is a strange thing to say, and it's not clear what it means. But it's a good thing. We know that because Noah also walks with God, and Abraham walks with God. So it looks like an idiom that means something like was righteous. Okay? But then at the end, there's another twist. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years, which is an interesting number of years. It's less years than the other patriarchs from Adam to Noah. And it sounds like more or less the length of a solar year. Okay, because there's 365 days in a solar year. So there might be some sort of astronomical speculation that underlies the lifespan of Enoch. In any case, he lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. And then it goes on to Methuselah. Well, what does that mean? The walking with God is interesting, but what does it mean that God took him? If God took him, he took him where? He didn't take him shopping. He didn't take him to Union Square. He took him somewhere, but the text doesn't say where. It doesn't say what this means. This is a very strange episode in the book of Genesis, and it indicates that Enoch was a special figure. There are other people in ancient Mesopotamia who did somehow go to heaven or gain some sort of immortality, but they're very few and far between. The hero of the flood in the Mesopotamian version actually is granted immortality. The flood hero and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Utnapishtim, gain immortality, but they're the only ones that do. It's not a category that's available to anybody else. So it looks like Enoch's story is something like the old Mesopotamian flood hero, where as a special favor, God took him up and maybe he lived somewhere special for a long time. But the text doesn't say what happened. So it's a cryptic text. Now, when there are cryptic texts in the Bible, particularly in the book of Genesis, later writers and later interpreters tended to seize on these cryptic, mysterious things and elaborate on them. So not surprisingly, and let me just say, this part of Genesis was written around the 6th century BCE. Not surprisingly, about 300 years later, someone wrote a sequel to these verses in Genesis called the Book of Enoch. In other words, when people want to know what happened to Enoch, eventually someone will say, here's what happened. That is to say, inquiring minds want to know. That's my personal motto, which I derived from, what's it called? The National Enquirer. That's when there used to be newspapers. But in the National Enquirer, they tell you things you want to know. Elvis is alive, aliens come down and live in the White House, things like that. So when you want to know about Enoch, how did he walk with God, and what does it mean that God took him? Someone finally, 300 years later, said, I've got the answer. I've got a book that Enoch wrote. Okay, and it's called the Book of Enoch. And in this book, Enoch tells what happened to him when God took him. And what happens in the Book of Enoch, there's a lot of other things that happen, but one of the key things is that Enoch has a mysterious ascent to heaven at the end of his life, and he gets a tour of heaven that is led by various angels. So the idea of walking with God is reinterpreted as walking with angels in a tour group. Okay, this is one of the first great tourist ventures in history. And the angels lead him around in heaven, and he looks down and sees things on earth, and they show him all these heavenly and earthly mysteries. Now, this picture here is the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is one of the most important ancient books that most people have never heard of, because it didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Okay, it was very influential, but it didn't make the final cut. It did, however, somehow remain in the sacred books in the Ethiopian Christian church. And so this is a copy of the Book of Enoch in Ethiopic, okay, in the Ethiopian Christian church. It was originally written in Aramaic, and I'll show you in a minute how we know that, but the translation into Ethiopic was the only fully preserved version of the Book of Enoch. We lost the original versions. Okay, so the only full version that we have is in Ethiopic. It's got this beautiful script, if you can see it here. We know that it was actually written in Aramaic because fragments of the Book of Enoch were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the first place where the Dead Sea Scrolls comes into my story. This is a copy of the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch, as I said, was probably written, or the part that concerns us was probably written in the 3rd century BC. This is a fragment from Cave 4 of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Cave 4 of Qumran. And so because the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found is called Qumran, so we call it 4Q, meaning it was Cave 4 from Qumran, and it's the Book of Enoch. And here we can see this is the original language of the book. It was written in Aramaic, and it was a big bestseller to the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, and we'll get to this later, but to give away another spoiler alert is that it's in the Book of Enoch that the concept of the afterlife is most fully realized. Okay, the crystallization of the idea of the afterlife probably begins in this Book of Enoch. This is why I said it's one of the most important books that no one's ever heard of. The idea of heaven and hell as destinations for people after they die is first found in this book. Okay, so we'll return to that later. I want to go back and look at some of the initial stages. But I want to emphasize that the Book of Enoch is a response to this cryptic story about Enoch in Genesis. He walked with God and was no more. Okay, this is the irritant, like in like to create that irritant that created the pearl. Okay, this is this bit of strangeness in the Bible that generated the idea that where Enoch went was heaven. There's another cryptic story in the Bible that contributes to this strangeness of the Enoch story, and that echoes the strangeness of the Enoch story. And this is the story of Elijah. Elijah is a prophet in the Book of Kings, and at the end of his life, it says that God took Elijah up into the sky in a fiery chariot. This is impressive too. Again, the interested reader, the inquiring reader, wants to know what happened to Elijah once he went up to the sky in a fiery chariot. Okay? In later interpretations, in later books, and we already see this in one of the later books of the Bible, Elijah lives in heaven and then comes down to announce the coming of the Messiah. This is one of the later ideas that develops out of, again, this cryptic text that says Elijah ascended up into heaven in a fiery chariot. So what was Elijah doing there, and what was he waiting for? In the Passover Seder every year, Jews pour a cup of wine for Elijah, and then you open the back door a little bit and hope the insects don't come in, so that Elijah can come in the back door and drink the wine, and that will welcome in Elijah as the harbinger of the Messiah. As Elijah is the one who will announce the coming of the Messiah. So there's a hopeful thing that one does to get Elijah to come back down. I don't know if Elijah likes the kind of cheap wine that we used when I was a kid in Passover Seders. Now that we're in California, I hope he's upgraded his wine cuisine a little bit. Maybe that's why he hasn't come yet. He really was waiting for that good Cabernet. Okay, but this is another strange thing in the Bible that sets speculation going about what happened to Elijah, what happened to Enoch, and these are things that create this opening for the idea of an afterlife. Now, another thing, and here these are different intersecting causes for this idea. Another thing that happens that I think is really crucial in developing this idea, that in creating the conceptual space for the concept of the afterlife, is what I call rereading and resonance. That is to say, people read biblical texts very closely in antiquity. Okay? And if the text had, let's say, metaphors that indicated, or expressions or figurative tropes that indicated these kind of heavenly mysteries, people seized on them, and this helped them to develop a full-blown idea of the afterlife. So this is the most famous, I don't think you can see the letters, but this is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. This is one of the most famous poems in the Bible. Okay? And this text is used very widely these days at funerals. Why? Because it's taken to be a text about heaven that describes people going to heaven and living with God in heaven. Now this is an interpretation of the poem that wasn't originally what the poem meant. Okay? Originally the poem was written in a world that didn't have this full-blown idea of the afterlife. And originally, and this is a kind of scholarly construct that one could argue with, but the general idea is that most of the Psalms, most of the religious poetry in the Book of Psalms had to do with worship at the temple in Jerusalem. This was during the period when the temple in Jerusalem was the central place of religious worship. This psalm in particular, it has been argued, and I agree, is probably describing a pilgrimage to the temple. According to the biblical laws, people had to make a pilgrimage to the temple 3 times a year at the major festivals and offer sacrifices at the temple to worship God at the temple in Jerusalem. So this song is arguably a beautiful metaphorical, poetic description of people making a pilgrimage to the temple and then arriving at the temple and offering their sacrifices. But the poem is done in such beautiful language that in a sense the language itself escapes its occasion. That is to say, the language conjures up a more transcendent, a more kind of mystical experience. And so this is why it becomes interpreted as a story about heaven. So let me read it to you. This is very familiar to you. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." This is a description of God through the metaphor of God as a shepherd. God as the good shepherd. Okay, and if God is the good shepherd, people are his sheep. And he's leading them somewhere. Where is he leading them? In the last line, it becomes explicit. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord." Well, in the Bible and in the book of Psalms, the term house of the Lord refers to the temple in Jerusalem. That's God's house. Okay? So this is a very specific term, and this is where they're going. So God is leading them like sheep going from one pasture place to another, and he's leading them to the temple in Jerusalem. This is why this is probably a description or something that evokes these thrice annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which would take you a few days to get to. Okay? And so here in this imagery, God is the shepherd guiding the people along, protecting them as they are going towards the temple in Jerusalem. So the people are sheep, and they're happy sheep. Why? Because God is such a good shepherd. He protects them. So he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. That's really good for a sheep. You like green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. That's nice too. Okay, so the sheep are having a very nice time. Everything's fertile. You get food, you get grass, you get water. The shepherd is leading you. He even restoreth my soul. Now in the Hebrew, this means he kind of revivifies me in a kind of psychological, spiritual sense. It doesn't mean the resurrection of the soul. It doesn't mean the resurrection of the dead. But you can see that this is just really happy sheep. Okay? They're really restored, they feel great, and it's the good shepherd that does this. But you can see how the words themselves and the evocative, resonant quality of the words can give rise to the idea of restoring the soul. That is to say, make you alive after you're dead. It doesn't originally mean that, but it comes to be interpreted that way. Okay? And so we can see that in the rereading and resonance of the words, you have the seeds of the idea of the afterlife. Okay? "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff comfort me." So even death doesn't scare these wandering sheep, because God's rod and God protects you against death. But notice that these images that are used of the valley of the shadow of death, of restoring my soul, putting these together gives an ambiance of the soul being resurrected in the face of death. You see what I mean? So it's when you read the text very closely, the resonance of the words starts to create concepts that aren't actually the plain sense of the experience that's addressed in the text. This is a pilgrimage to the temple, which is like being restored and like being protected from death. And you don't fear any evil, because God is protecting you against evil and against death. Then you arrive. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runneth over. This table is in the temple where you make the sacrifice. Okay? And after the sacrifice, you have a festive meal. So this is a festive banquet in God's house, at God's table. And the metaphor here flips from God being a good shepherd to God being a good host. Not just a good shepherd, the best shepherd. And now, when you come to his house, he's the best host. Okay, so he prepares this table. This is the virtue of hospitality, which is a huge thing in the Middle East to this day. It's a huge thing in Jewish culture. Let me just tell you, my grandmother told me I was her favorite grandson because I would eat whatever she put in front of me. This is how important hospitality, setting a table and eating it. I never told my other cousins that. I didn't want them to be jealous. But this is the virtue of hospitality. So God is your host, and he's setting a table for you, and your cup is running over, meaning it's, I've been to restaurants before that wherever you take one sip, they run over and fill it up again. That's what this is like. When the cup is like running over, there's complete abundance here. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, goodness and mercy following you all the days of your life, that's very nice. That's ideal. That's a paradise. That's the feeling of being in the temple, worshiping God at his table and at his house. Okay, so being at the temple is a kind of perfect experience. This is what is being evoked in the psalm. And I would like to dwell there forever. But let me tell you something, though. The text doesn't actually say forever. It says for length of days, which means for a long time. Orech yamim. This is the King James Version, and for some reason they translate it as forever. Okay? Once you have it translated as forever, instead of just being, I'd like to stay here for as long as I can, once it says forever, again, that sounds like immortality. That sounds like a vision of the afterlife, of living in heaven. And let me give you one more piece of the puzzle here. At a certain point, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. First, the Babylonians destroyed it in the 6th century, and then you had the Babylonian exile. Then later, the Jews came back to Jerusalem and built another temple, which scholars very cleverly call the Second Temple. Scholars are very clever about these terms. And then a few centuries later, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. So after the destruction of the Second Temple, there's no temple anymore. So there's no physical house of the Lord to visit anymore. This psalm is still in the Bible, though. The referent, therefore, of the house of the Lord comes to be seen as not his earthly house, but his heavenly house. Okay, and so this is how this psalm becomes a psalm about living in God's heavenly house after you're dead. Okay, he defeats death, he restores your soul, you live in the house of the Lord in heaven forever. So it comes to be understood as a psalm about the afterlife. And this is why this psalm is used is recited at funerals in Judaism and Christianity today. One of the things that we see in this psalm is the development of the idea of the afterlife. It wasn't originally there in the words of this psalm. This was about taking a pilgrimage to the temple of God in Jerusalem and offering sacrifices there, and the wonderful spiritual experience that one would have doing that. Okay? But after there's no temple anymore, and even maybe when there was still a temple, the words are so powerful, the metaphors are so evocative, that they become more than metaphors and come to signify eternal life and living in heaven and defeating death. You see what I mean? So the development, in this respect, the development of the idea of the afterlife is based on reading poems like this really intensely and understanding some of their figurative and metaphorical language very literally. So the idea comes from the words themselves and from the poetry themselves, from the resonance of the poetry. Now let me just say, this is great poetry. And so great poetry can create all sorts of new meanings. And that's precisely, I think, what happened with this psalm, and this is one of the things that creates the idea of the afterlife. Isn't that interesting? Next time you hear this poem, but don't tell anyone this. Don't tell them that it originally didn't mean that, but the words kind of created its own resonance, its own echoes, and developed into a new idea. Okay. Now, back into the Bible. There are other texts that also give rise to these sorts of ideas. Some of them, like Psalm 23, are, these are mostly poetic texts. Some of these are poetic texts that initially did not refer to the afterlife, but the poetry is so good, the expressions are so powerful, that they give rise to that kind of resonance. Okay? Sometimes metaphorical language is used, but the metaphor itself is about overcoming death. So one of these we have in, the prophet Isaiah is one of the key people here. This is a painting by Chagall about Isaiah's initiatory vision, where he sees God in his heavenly temple, and it's all smoky and it's shaking, and Isaiah thinks he's about to die. One of these very strange angels, they're called seraphim, flies towards him with a smoking ember in his hand, which is from the heavenly altar. And let me just say, this is a very frightening vision. Okay, Isaiah thinks he's going to die, and if you saw a six-winged seraphim fly at you with this smoking hot thing in his hand and coming for your face, you would think you were going to die too. So this is a near-death experience, but in the heavenly temple, in this vision. It's an out-of-body experience. In California, we can have those things, right? But instead of dying, the seraph touches Isaiah's lips and says, your lips are now pure. Your lips are now made holy, so essentially so that you can now speak God's holy words. And this is what makes Isaiah a prophet. A prophet is basically someone who speaks the words that he hears God saying in heaven. Okay, I describe the prophets as a sort of religious UPS person. They deliver the message that God sends from heaven. So his lips are purified, and now he can speak these divine words. Now, this vision of God in heaven itself is something that gives rise to ideas of the afterlife. Okay? And this near-death experience also contributes to that. So one can see Isaiah's vision as giving rise to later visions of what the spirit of the dead will see when they go up to heaven. It's not what it means originally, but it can be, but it flows into that kind of resonance. Now, later in the book of Isaiah, there is a description of this cataclysm at the end of this era, and Isaiah says, your bodies will live, but your dead will live. Their bodies will rise. You who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. This is a very key text in the development of the idea of the afterlife, because he's talking about dead people waking up. You who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. That doesn't usually happen. Okay? This is the resurrection of the dead. But scholars agree that he doesn't really mean it, that is to say, this is a metaphor. This part of Isaiah was written by someone who wasn't Isaiah, but his writings were stuck into the book of Isaiah. Scholars very cleverly refer to him as either second Isaiah or third Isaiah. And this was probably written around the time of the Babylonian exile, when the thing that was hoped for and anticipated was a return of the exiles to Israel. Okay? And one of the expressions, one of the metaphors that was used to describe that hope was that Israel is dead and God will bring it back to life by bringing the people back to their land, back from the suburbs of Babylon to Israel. So most scholars will agree that this is actually a metaphor. By saying your dead will live, it means your exiles will be restored to life by the exiles being able to return to Jerusalem. Now, if that's the context of this passage in Isaiah, we've lost that context. I mean, if this Isaianic prophet was saying this to the people in exile, that, God will, your dead will live, your bodies will rise up. If that's a metaphor for returning from exile to the promised land, that metaphor would have been evident when Isaiah was saying this to the people in exile. But once you write it down and it becomes part of the book of Isaiah, that context is not there anymore. So what was probably a metaphor in this text, when you read it as a text, it looks like it's not a metaphor. It looks like Isaiah is saying the dead will rise. The earth will give birth to her dead. Your dead will live, their bodies will rise. So this is a text, again, whose resonance is very clear. The dead will rise. Okay? Even if it was originally intended as a metaphor, once you lose that context that says this is a metaphor, it looks like a text about the resurrection of the dead. So this is another key moment in the development of this idea. It comes from the resonance of the words. It comes from in a sense, reading a metaphor as a literal statement. Now, one can say that that's a misreading, but it's not really a misreading because there's no clues that it's a metaphor, unless you say this was said in the 6th century to the people in exile. So once it becomes textualized, you lose that context and it becomes a literal idea a literal statement of the resurrection of the dead. You see what I mean? So here's another place where the resonance of the text gives rise to idea, even if that was not the original context or the original meaning or the original intention of the text. Okay, and we're going to see some of the metaphors and expressions of this text in a later text in just a moment. Now, before we go on to that, I want to introduce another prophet, and this is Ezekiel. Ezekiel is an amazing prophet. He also was doing his prophetic activity during the time of the Babylonian exile. He actually lived in a place called Tel Aviv, which was one of the suburbs of Babylon. And the modern Israeli city of Tel Aviv was named after where Ezekiel lived in the Babylonian exile. So Ezekiel's in exile, and he has this very strange vision that is his inaugural vision that makes him into a prophet, much like Isaiah's very strange vision. And he also sees these multiple winged cherubim flying around, and they have eyes in their wings, and there's fiery wheels. It's an amazing vision. His vision also flows into later ideas of what one will see when you die and go to heaven, what it looks like to see God on his heavenly throne. So Ezekiel has this great vision. Ezekiel has a bunch of other visions too. The one that I want to talk about in particular here that plays a role in our story is Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones. Okay, many of you will know this. There's an old song about this. Them bones, them dry bones. Oh, hear the word of the Lord. I think it was a slave spiritual. Here's part of what it says. I got a little too busy on Google finding little Bible verses. It starts out, and God said to me, this is Ezekiel speaking, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And I answered, "O Lord God, you know. So Ezekiel is having this vision that God gives him of all of these bones in the valley of the dry bones. And God says, can these bones live? And then later he says, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will put breath in you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Well, this too looks and smells and feels like a story of the resurrection of the dead. It's a bunch of bones that God breathes the breath of life into and they come back to life. And so that's what happens in Ezekiel's vision in the valley of dry bones. But then God gives a clue later on that this is a metaphor. He says, then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say our bones are dried and our hope is lost. But I, God, will breathe life into these bones, and the people of Israel will come back to life by being essentially brought back into the land of Israel. So God tells Ezekiel that this is a metaphor, that his vision of the dry bones coming together is a metaphor of the restoration of the people of Israel who will be brought back to Israel from Babylonian exile. So this one's much clearer than that example in Isaiah, that this is a metaphor. This vision is a metaphor for restoring the people, bringing them back to Jerusalem. But nonetheless, the resonance remains. That is to say, God gives the punchline here that this is a metaphor for the restoration of Israel. But the scene itself of the coming together of the dry bones and of God bringing them back to life is so impressive that it's very easy to read it as a prophecy of the resurrection of the dead. So this is another step in the development of this idea of the afterlife. Originally it's a metaphor, and in this text it's very clear that it's a metaphor. But it's very easy to take the power of this text, the power of this vision, and take it as a real prophecy of the future resurrection of the dead. The text didn't originally mean that, but it's such a great text that it kind of carries its meaning to this second level of significance that just overwhelms you. Okay? And this is how most people have read this passage in the thousands of years since Ezekiel, just bracketing the part where God says, by the way, this is just a metaphor. Now, some of these things come together in two late books. One is the Book of Daniel, and the other is the Book of Enoch, which I already introduced to you. But let's go to Daniel first. Here's Daniel. Here's a picture of him in the Sistine Chapel. You'll notice he's got a lot of wonderful, bright colors. It used to be all kind of gray and kind of schmutzy, but they cleaned it up. Do you know about that? They restored the Sistine Chapel. It used to be much darker. Now it's very bright, but some people don't like it. Some people like the dark version. It's more somber. So this is the Book of Daniel. The Book of Daniel is the latest book that made it into the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. The Book of Daniel is written by someone who's read all of the previous books, and he's very strongly influenced, particularly by the book of Isaiah. And in the book of Daniel, we see the book of Isaiah being read as a prophecy of the resurrection of the dead. We see this in this passage here that relies on the text that I showed you just a minute ago. In Daniel chapter 12, he has a vision of this great change of the era, the end of this world and the beginning of the next world. And he has this vision which the angel Gabriel deciphers for him. And the angel Gabriel says, many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So here, for the first time explicitly, we have the vision of the afterlife as consisting of the good people going to heaven, the bad people going to hell. the good people going to a nice place. Some of them shine in the sky like stars, and the bad people go to a place of shame and everlasting contempt. And in the book of Daniel, this is meant literally. This is literally a prophecy of the end of the world, the day of judgment, when the good will rise, the bad will rise, and they go to their respective places. Okay? Now, what I want to point out is that Daniel, the author of Daniel here, is explicitly drawing upon the language of Isaiah that we saw a few slides back. This one here. You who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. Now, this is probably a metaphor for Israel being restored in Isaiah. But here in Daniel, many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. This is basically quoting Isaiah, but now it's not a metaphor. Now it really is talking about the resurrection of the dead, the literal resurrection of the dead. Okay? But if you put this text side by side with Isaiah, it looks like the same text. He's just quoting the same words, but now he's taking it literally and not metaphorically. So this is the crystallization of the idea that we don't just turn into dirt, okay, and we don't return our breath to God, but rather we stay in the earth for a while, and that at the end of this era, at the time of the great judgment, people will wake up again, and you'll have this great sorting where the good people have everlasting life, which is in a nice sense, and the bad people have everlasting shame and contempt. Now, this is in the book of Daniel, okay? And it could have been an innovation of this author, or this could have been the normal way that people read Isaiah and Ezekiel and the stories of Enoch and Elijah at this time. The first time that we see these ideas really being put into practice by a whole community. Oh, by the way, here's a picture of the resurrection of the dead. This is a Christian picture, so I think it's Jesus in the middle who's resurrecting, but he's welcoming other people coming out of their coffins too. The first community that really accepted these ideas and put them into practice was the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, we saw some pictures of Dead Sea Scrolls previously. This is where they lived. They're called the Dead Sea Scrolls because they lived by the Dead Sea. Okay, and these are some of the caves where the scrolls were squirreled away, and the place where they lived is on the plateau above these caves. Now you'll notice this is not California. This is a hot, dry, really unpleasant place. It's more like Phoenix. It's hot, it's dry. The big lake there is called the Dead Sea. It's called the Dead Sea because nothing can live in it. It's so minerally and saline and stuff. If you go to it, you float. But nothing lives there. It's dead. It's hot, dry. It's one of the most unpleasant places to live in the world. Now, why would you want to live there? Why would these people of the Dead Sea Scrolls want to live there? They lived there for a couple of reasons. One was to purify themselves from the bad things of this world. And so you go out into the desert, you sweat, you separate yourself from civilization, and so you're purifying yourself. The second reason that they went there is because if you read the books of Isaiah and Ezekiel very closely, it gives you some clues about where the end of the world will happen and where paradise will be. And this is where they thought paradise was going to be. They thought that this most horrible, unpleasant place in the world by the Dead Sea was going to become the new Garden of Eden. Okay? And they get this from a passage in Isaiah where it says, let me make sure I get this right. A voice calls out, "Prepare in the desert the way of the Lord, and make straight in the wilderness a road for our God. Okay, so they said, Isaiah says to do this, so we do it. We're preparing in the desert the way of the Lord. So this is where they went. But why this desert in particular? In Ezekiel, in one of his visions, he sees a river flowing out from this new temple that will be built in this new era. And the river from the temple is called one of the rivers of Eden, and it flows down south and makes the Dead Sea alive again. So in this Ezekiel's vision, this is in Ezekiel chapter 42, this river from the new temple will make the Dead Sea live, and not only live, but become a paradise. So this area here, by the shores of the Dead Sea, now let me just say this is very sound real estate. You buy low, and then it becomes paradise, and it's a wonderful place to live. So they expected this to become essentially the new Garden of Eden. Okay, so it looks terrible, and they're purifying themselves, they're sweating, but this is going to be paradise central when the judgment day comes. So they are preparing themselves for the judgment day. They're purifying themselves so that they will be those who gain everlasting life in a good sense. And they're preparing themselves essentially to re-enter the Garden of Eden, because this will become a new Garden of Eden. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we call these people Essenes. There's a lot of texts that describe what they're doing. It says, these are the spiritual foundations, in one of their texts, it says, these are the spiritual foundations for the sons of truth in the world. And they regarded themselves as the children of truth. The reward of all those who walk in it will be healing, plentiful peace in a long life, fruitful offspring with all everlasting blessings, eternal joy with endless life. Here's immortality. And a crown of glory with majestic robes in eternal light. So essentially they're going to be living forever, a life of perfection, a life where they shine with a crown of glory and majestic robes in eternal life. And it says God chose them, and to them belongs all the glory of Adam. So here's an idea that they're returning to the Garden of Eden, but in an even better Garden of Eden. Instead of being like Adam made out of earth, they will be an Adam that shines like the illuminated sky, that shines like the sun. Okay, a crown of glory with majestic robes in eternal light. So it's sort of like a new heavenly Adam, and that's the life that they're going to be living in this new paradise. So this is what the Essenes were doing in Qumran, in this hot, dry place. They were living, according to one of their texts, it says they're living in the company of angels. This means that they are still human, but they're getting ready for the great transformation into eternal life, into eternal light, into glorious garments of light. In a sense, they're sort of turning into angels. Okay, and they're living in the company of angels. We call this realized eschatology. That is to say, the end hasn't come yet, the judgment day hasn't come yet, but they went to Qumran to live this life as if the end had already come, and they'd already been given eternal life and turned into quasi-angels. So this is what they were doing. And this is why the Essene community expanded greatly during this period, because people wanted to go. That's a nice place to go to. It's going to be paradise. You're already living the life in this new Garden of Eden. This Qumran community, the Essenes, very strange, interesting people. As I said, these are the first people that really had a full-blown idea of the afterlife. They were putting into effect what they read very intently from the books of Daniel, from the books of Isaiah, Ezekiel, older stories of Enoch and so forth. And let me say they loved the Book of Enoch. I showed you a picture of the Enoch from Qumran. Let me do that again. Here we are. 4Q Enoch. So this is a fragment of Enoch, a scroll of the Book of Enoch from Cave 4 of Qumran. And this is one of the favorite books of this Essene community. They loved reading the Book of Enoch. So I want to go back and tell you a little bit about what they were reading in the Book of Enoch that they were putting into effect. In the Book of Enoch, as I said, angels give Enoch a tour of heaven, and he sees the heavenly mysteries, and he sees all sorts of things down on earth. One of the things that he sees is the place where people go after, a place where people's spirits dwell after they die, and then where they get assigned to after the judgment day. Okay, and this is actually earlier than the text of Daniel that I showed you a minute ago. And so it looks like the Book of Enoch is where these ideas really first crystallized. Okay, and the Dead Sea Scroll people love this. So here's an excerpt of the Book of Enoch where the angel Raphael is giving Enoch this tour, and he shows him the mountains of the dead. And Raphael says to Enoch, "These hollow places are where the spirits of the souls of the dead will be gathered. For this purpose they were created, and here the souls of all human beings should be gathered. And look, these are the pits for the place of their confinement. Thus they were made until the day on which they will be judged, and until the time of day of the end of the great judgment that will be exacted from them." Now let me say, the Book of Enoch is not written very well. It's not beautiful prose. This is probably the reason that it didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible. Okay, it's also written in Aramaic. There's no Hebrew in it, which is probably another reason why it didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible. The book of Daniel is half Hebrew and half Aramaic. Okay, and so it made it in, probably because of the Hebrew. So the Book of Enoch didn't make it in, even though it was tremendously influential. So this thing I just read you is Enoch seeing on his tour of heaven the hollow places in these mountains where the spirits of the dead wait for Judgment Day. Isn't that interesting? This is the very first occasion of that idea. Then he goes on and finds the mountain of God where the tree of life is. Okay? And he says here on this mountain was the most wonderful tree, the tree of life. And the angel says, the high mountain who you saw, this peak is like the throne of God. And as for this fragrant tree, no flesh has the right to touch it until the great judgment, in which there will be vengeance on all and a consummation forever. And then it, meaning the tree of life, will be given to the righteous and the pious, and its fruit will be fruit for the chosen. So when the judgment day comes and the good people who've been waiting in this area, it's sort of like one of the halls in SFO where you wait for your flight forever. This is where you are. And then finally you get to board, and the good people, the first class people, get to go and eat from the fruit of the tree of life. Okay? This is essentially going back to the Garden of Eden. This is a view of the afterlife as paradise. And you eat from the tree of life, which Adam and Eve were not able to do. Now you finally get to do it, and you live in this paradise forever. On the other side of this mountain, the angels show Enoch a nastier place, a valley, a deep valley that's of hard rock and no trees are on it. And Enoch marveled at this and said, "Why is this other land blessed, and why is this valley cursed?" And then another angel, probably named Sariel, one of the holy angels who was with me, said, "This cursed valley is for those who are cursed forever. Here will be gathered all the cursed." Okay, and here is where they will be forever. So that's what happens. Oh, and also says, "These are the pits for the place of their confinement." Oh, excuse me. Oh, here these spirits are separated for this great torment, where they have scourges and tortures of the cursed forever. So this is the invention of hell in the Book of Enoch, where the bad spirits go after they die. And it's just down the street from this new Garden of Eden where the good people go. So this is what they're reading at Qumran. They're reading the Book of Enoch. They're reading the Book of Daniel. They're preparing themselves for this day of judgment, and they're purifying themselves so that they will be the ones who get to eat from the fruit of the tree of life, who will take on the glory of Adam and live forever in this wonderful existence. Let me add, back to Qumran. Yeah, these people, let me put it this here. So they're what looks like a God-forsaken deserty wilderness, in their expectations will become a new Garden of Eden. In this painting, you can see in the upper left Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. In this new vision of the afterlife, the idea is that the good people get to go back to the Garden of Eden and dwell there forever in this new kind of angelic way. Now let me add that while they're preparing for going back to the Garden of Eden, in this hot, dry place, they also, these people living there, the Dead Sea Scrolls people, the Essenes, invented a kind of asceticism. That is to say, they were celibate. They were in the group in the desert were all men. They wore white linen garments. And they believed that they were living a kind of angelic life. Now, part of living like angels, in their understanding, was that they didn't have sex. Why? Because angels don't have sex. Why? Because angels don't really have bodies. Okay? But angels also wear white linen garments. We see this in the Book of Daniel. So they're inventing this ascetic existence where they separate themselves from material possessions. Oh yeah, they also invented socialism. I should tell Bernie this. The Dead Sea Scroll people, when you entered into the community of the Essenes, you had to give up all of your material possessions and all of your wealth, and they were put into a bank for the whole community. So they invented socialism or communism, they invented asceticism, and they first people that put into effect this idea of the visions of the afterlife, of heaven and hell and judgment day. So they invented a lot of stuff. Some of this stuff we call apocalypticism, this expectation of the judgment day and the defeat of evil and the resurrection of the dead and the coming of the Messiah. Now, the Essenes were very fruitful thinkers. They actually expected 3 messiahs, not just one. 3 is better than 1, isn't it? Devotees of the Trinity would certainly say that. So they expected a royal Messiah, a descendant of King David. They also expected a prophetic Messiah who would be like Elijah. And they expected a priestly Messiah who would be a new high priest like Aaron. So they expected 3 messiahs. Now let me add something. They're living by the Dead Sea. They have this full-blown apocalyptic worldview, this ascetic worldview, preparing for the end of the world and the dawn of a new paradise. They're also very close to the Jordan River. Now there was somebody else, and they're living there in the 2nd century and 1st century BCE, and then the 1st century CE. In other words, they're straddling the BCs and the ADs. They are contemporary and a little earlier than some other very famous people, namely Jesus, John the Baptist, and Paul. In fact, John the Baptist was doing his thing at the Jordan River, probably just a few miles away from Qumran. He was also out in the wilderness, in Isaiah, prepare in the wilderness the way for the way of the Lord. This is what John the Baptist quotes in the Gospels. That's why he's out in the desert preparing the way of the Lord, baptizing people to purify them from their sins. Okay? The Essenes were doing something very similar. They're purifying themselves, and they had, outside of their dwelling place, they had these ritual baths where they would purify themselves whenever they came inside. So they were essentially taking little baptismal baths every day when they went inside the community, so that they would be ritually pure inside their community, so that they could live with the angels in their midst. So this idea of immersion in water to cleanse you from sins, of preparing for the way of the Lord, the kingdom of God is coming. The language that we see in the New Testament is also the language of these Essenes in Qumran. They're all expecting the same sort of things. Isn't that interesting? Judgment Day, the coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead. So this is a really interesting community. Some people have even speculated that John the Baptist might have been an Essene. I think that's a little too strong of a speculation because some of the things about early Christianity are different than the Essenes. For example, in Christianity there's only one Messiah, not three. But I think John the Baptist and the Essenes were neighbors, okay? And they shopped at the same stores and things like that. So it's too much to say they're the same religion, but they're different groups of they're different Jewish groups who are living at the same time and preparing themselves in the desert for this cleansing and sorting and destruction and resurrection. So this is one of the really interesting things about the Dead Sea Scroll community. They not only show us this new community with these new ideas that we hadn't seen before, but they show us other things that are going on at the same time as the very earliest Christian ideas and activities. One of the things that the people at Qumran did, they believed themselves to be living in the company of angels. They had worship poems on the Sabbath where they would have a kind of collective ascent to heaven and sing songs of praise to God in heaven with the angels. This was part of their Sabbath liturgy. Okay? As I said, they also believed that they were camped out in the future Garden of Eden. Now, Paul, who's one of the great creators of early Christian theology, was doing some very same things. Here's a picture. This picture is a picture from what Paul in the New Testament writes about in 2 Corinthians. And let me read you this text. Paul says, and Paul is an amazing stylist. He likes to be very suggestive and obscure and oblique and kind of play a little bit with the audience. So he often doesn't say exactly what he means, but circles around until you get the idea. He says in 2 Corinthians, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Okay, so one of the things that I've shown you is a bunch of different visions of God in his temple, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Elijah, these other pictures. Here is Paul's visionary ascent to heaven. He says, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Now this is very coy of him. He says, I know a person in Christ who had this experience. It's really himself. Okay, but he's not quite admitting it. And this picture is of him. He says, and whether this being caught up into heaven was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. So does the heavenly ascent, is that something that you do with your physical body? Or is that something that's a purely spiritual body? Paul hedges. Okay, he says, I don't know. Only God knows. But these are the two possibilities, and he doesn't want to commit himself. I only know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. So here is Paul's experience, his own visionary experience, vision and revelation of being ascending to heaven. And what does he find in heaven but paradise? He's having an ascent to the Garden of Eden, but the heavenly Garden of Eden. Okay, this is like Enoch's vision of the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life in heaven, where the spirits of the good dead will go. So this is Paul's experience. It's very much like the experience of these Dead Sea Scroll people, but he's doing it solo. Okay, and to him, he says, was revealed things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. So these are the secrets of heaven, the secrets of the afterlife, the secrets of salvation. Now, again, Paul is very coy. He says he heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat, but then he goes on, and in all of his letters, he tells you these things. He tells you what's going to happen at the end. He tells you how the spiritual ascent happens. He tells you all these other things. So here's another text from 1 Corinthians where he spills some of these beans. He says, behold, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable body must put on imperishability, and this mortal body must put on immortality. Well, here he says that the final ascent to heaven, the resurrection of the dead, is not in the body, but in the spirit. So he hedged about that before, but now he comes and tells you. The physical body puts on an imperishable body, the mortal body puts on immortality. Okay? This is the collective ascent to heaven that Paul says is the resurrection of the dead after Judgment Day, after the Messiah comes. And of course for Paul, the Messiah is Christ, but it's the second coming of Christ that will do this. He says that this imperishable spiritual body that people will put on, here's what he says, and here I'm making a link with the theology of the Dead Sea Scroll people, where the people put on the glory of Adam in this new immortal existence. What Paul says is that the righteous resurrected dead will not put on the body, the spiritual body of Adam, but will put on the spiritual body of the new Adam. Who's the new Adam? In Paul's theology, the new Adam is Christ. So he's doing something to this older theology of going back to the Garden of Eden as a new Adam. Now he says you're going back to the heavenly garden, the heavenly paradise, in the body of the new Adam. So here's how he describes this. And again, Paul is very elliptical, he's elusive, he doesn't tell you straight out. But he says the first man, Adam, became a living being. But the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So here he's linking Adam with Christ. Adam now, he says, was the guy who had a body. Christ is the new Adam who's simply spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of the dust. So this is Adam, from dust to dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those of the dust. As is the man of heaven, so are those of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, so we will also bear the image of the man of heaven. This is how Paul talks. It's very poetic. It's very elusive. He's saying our physical body is the body of Adam, but when we turn into spirits, we take on the body of the new Adam, the spiritual body of Christ. Okay? And so this is what is going to happen. He says, and this is in 1 Thessalonians, we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with the resurrected dead. So the dead fly up to heaven in their spiritual bodies, but also those who are alive, who are Christians, who are the righteous, will also fly up into the sky. We will be caught up in the clouds together with the resurrected dead to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. That's it. That's a very clear description of the afterlife. And in the New Testament, we have all of these things laid out. The goats are separated from the sheep, the good people from the bad people. The good people fly up, the bad people go to hell. Sorry, bad people. So here's a picture of hell. This becomes the standard view. And let me say, when Paul is saying these things, he's giving a Christian inflection to traditional Jewish ideas. We know that because we see those Jewish ideas in the Essenes of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So much of what Paul is saying and what the Dead Sea Scroll people are saying are separated by just a couple of decisive boundary markers. Right? Who's the Messiah, when it's going to be. But the picture of what's going to happen is very much the same because it's mostly drawn from intensively close readings of Old Testament texts. But also Enoch. Oh, I have to tell you one more thing about Enoch. Enoch is actually quoted in the New Testament. Enoch, the Book of Enoch. It didn't make it into the Old Testament, but it was a religious text, not only to the Essenes, but also to the early Christians. So in the Book of Jude, which is one of those really small books, I think it was written by Paul McCartney, but John Lennon made it better. Sorry. My wife tells me not to make jokes like that. The Book of Jude quotes the Book of Enoch as if Enoch is a sacred text. So the early Christians were reading the Book of Enoch also. So they're all reading the same books. So these are ideas that are shared in Judaism and in early Christianity at the time. So these become standard ideas in Judaism, in Christianity, and from there it goes into Islam. Here's a nice picture of hell from a medieval mosaic, and one of my favorite paintings by Hieronymus Bosch. There's one of the lords of hell, the demon up there that's eating people. So it's a very unpleasant place. Here's a picture of heaven from a Persian miniature. There's often more than one heaven. In this picture, there's 7 heavens. Okay, I think Paul says that there's 3 heavens, but heavens, good things tend to grow. So you end up getting 7 heavens. And so here's a beautiful picture of the 7 heavens, and there's all sorts of angels, and there's sacred trees. There's probably the tree of life in these different heavens. And this becomes then the standard view, again, in Judaism, Christianity, and in Islam. Thank you.